welcome to the X-22 Report. My name is Dave, and this is episode 322, and today's date is March 24th, 2014, and the title of this episode is World Focused on Russia While U.S. and NATO Build Up Military Assets. Because what have we been seeing? Well, we've been seeing the Ukraine acting president, the Ukraine prime minister, they both were put into power. They were not elected. Same with other government officials in Ukraine. They just been talking about war, Russia invading, mass buildup of troops along the border, and Russia said, listen, use the airplanes, fly over Russia, use the open air treaty. We will show you we are not building up troops. You can actually drive into the country, and they made this offer to Ukraine, drive into the country and you can go along the border and see that we are not building troops up. But if you notice, the government officials in the United States, the government officials in the EU, and Ukraine government officials, they are all talking war all the time. That's all you hear out of them. And the reason for this is because as they're making everyone focus on Russia, they are slowly building up military assets because we know exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to provoke something to get a war started. Now, this could happen in Ukraine, this could happen in Syria, this could happen in Iran, or it could happen in China. It doesn't really matter. They don't care. The players are all the same. It doesn't matter to them how the war gets started because everybody will be involved. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in this report, but let's get into the economic collapse news. And we understand that most of the calculations done by the government, by the Fed, are all manipulated. But what we're seeing right now is that factory orders are in a decline, and this is the biggest miss in 13 months, and jobs are growing at a slower pace. Can't imagine why. Well, it must be the weather because that's what they blame everything on. But as we know, the weather is not affecting every single place. It only affects certain places, maybe for a day or two, and the plows come, they clean it up, the streets are salted, and everything goes back to normal. So this whole weather thing is completely blown out of proportion, and it is a cover to make sure everyone doesn't realize that this economy is really starting to decline. It's starting to implode on itself. And this is why they've been making the excuse about housing in the spring, where they're saying the winter weather is going to affect the spring sales, and the hot weather is going to affect the summer sales. And they're just going to keep up with these ridiculous arguments that they're going to have to cover up what's actually going on. And there's also a decline in new orders from 59.6 to 58. So we can see that, again, the economy is not doing as well as they keep trying to push on us. All they're doing is, yes, we're in a recovery, believe us, believe us, believe us. And you do not have to do this if we are actually in a recovery. Now, Obamacare, was supposed to bring in revenue, supposed to bring in tax revenue for the government to sustain this debt. It was supposed to force every single American into insurance, and if you didn't buy insurance, you'll be taxed and penalized. And this whole entire Obamacare is not going well. And what we're seeing right now is Obamacare is adding billions in economic costs and millions of paperwork hours, according to a new report released on Monday. From a regulatory perspective, the law has imposed more than $27.2 billion in total private sector cost, $8 billion in unfunded state burdens, and more than 159 million paperwork hours on local governments and affected entities. What's more troubling, the law has generated $2.6 billion in annualized benefits compared to $6.8 billion in annualized costs. So this thing is costing a lot more than it's bringing in. It is a complete failure. Why? Because the American people do not have the jobs to support this health care program. This is the biggest problem. I don't know. They're living in this another world. Their salaries continually go up in Congress. They have fantastic benefits, and they really don't realize what's going on all around America. And this whole entire program is completely crumbling down because they believe these calculations from the Fed, from the BLS. They believe the propaganda that we're in a recovery, and most of them are clueless. But the president and the Fed, they all know exactly what's going on. Some of the other lawmakers, congressmen, they have no clue. They're just listening to everyone, and they're just going along and getting their funds and their investment ideas from everybody. But what we're seeing right now is that the central bankers, the U.S. government, the Obama administration, they realize that the economy is really not doing well. It is imploding. Housing's not doing well. Retail is not doing well. And people can say, oh, the brick and mortar stores, they're not doing well because everyone's going to the internet. Well, that's kind of false too, because all these brick and mortar stores have internet sites. We would see everyone running from all these brick and mortar to Amazon or some of the other big ones, and they would see this incredible increase in sales, but we're not actually seeing that. And also, the numbers came in during the holiday season that the internet sales wasn't as great as they thought they were going to be. But again, what we're seeing is that the Obama administration, the central bankers, are trying to put the squeeze on Russia. And we see that, and Russia has been not fighting back, but kind of showing the world that these sanctions don't work. And they've been talking about trade with China, with India, with North Korea. If they decide to put the sanctions on the entire country, which they have not done, they only done it on individuals. Of course, these aren't really sanctions. These are just to make the world believe and the American people believe that the government is actually doing something. But what's interesting is that, Russia said that they would sell natural gas and oil to China, and they would completely bypass the dollar, and anyone can use other currencies or gold to purchase this, and that would have a direct effect on the US dollar. And they also said that they're seeing that China's yuan may become a third reserve currency in the world in the future. This forecast can be made on figures of domestic economic growth. Probably the country will keep high GDP growth rate, and the GDP volume will increase to around 14 to 16 trillion US dollars for a brief period of time. The indicator is comparable to the European Union and the United States. So they're letting everyone know, listen, if you go ahead with this, we're going to get rid of the dollar. We're going to start dumping treasury bonds. We're going to shift all our trade to the other nations, and we will continually bypass the dollar, and we will start pumping up the Chinese yuan to become the reserve currency of the world, if you like to play this game. And we wouldn't even have to fire a shot. All we would have to do is do this economically. And of course, the United States, the European Union, they are on life support, just barely getting by each day, and one little hiccup brings the whole thing down. It's so fragile right now, and they know it. The U.S. government knows it, because if they truly wanted to impose sanctions, and the United States was strong and the European nation was strong, they would just impose the sanctions right on Russia to show we mean business. But again, they can't do that because they understand what's going to happen, and if they go ahead and impose sanctions on Russia and the economy of the United States and Europe completely implode, everyone would look at the Fed and the U.S. government and say, look, you just imposed sanctions and you destroyed us. And all the blame would shift to them, and this is definitely not what they want. Now, we understand over the weekend MasterCard and Visa jumped on the bandwagon, and they were imposing sanctions, and they stopped the processing of the Visa and MasterCard. But now they started back up, and they reversed their decision. But since that time, Russia said, you know what? We're ready to launch a payment system in a couple of months, and we might not need you anymore. And Moscow says its own national payment system may become fully operative within months. And this continues and says, the Payment System Pro 100 is technologically ready to provide national processing in the near future. We estimate it will take a couple of months as key Russian banks that account for more than 40% of the market are already linked to the Pro 100 payment system. And again, they are going to go ahead without the United States, without the United States firms, without trade with European nations and the United States. And they are ready and willing to do this, and the European nations, the United States, they understand this. They know exactly what is going on. Now, to keep up with all these sanctions, where the European nations are adding more sanctions, the U.S. added more sanctions, well, Moscow has introduced sanctions against Canada in response to Canada's unacceptable moves damaging bilateral relations. And this is, a tit for tat. Let's just get back at them, and the whole thing is really doing absolutely nothing for anyone. It doesn't affect the countries, it affects individuals. So right now at this point it is really meaningless. Now IMF's Christine Lagarde is out there, and we understand that in April, in the middle of April, the United States is supposed to pass legislation that will give more voting power to the emerging economies like China. It will give more voting power to them and take voting power away from the United States. And right now, the U.S. is kind of stalling on this. I guess they're a little nervous, and this goes on to say, and I mentioned this before in other reports, that all of this is coming about at the same time that we are hearing news about this April 11th date when the value of the dollar is going to decline. We'll have to see that happens. And saying thanks to Big Mouth on the People Forum, we also see that there are very specific meetings set up around this time that have to do with IMF and other nations. So all of this is starting to fit together, and we'll have to see what happens during this period, because if this does happen, the value of the dollar will decrease, and this will make it much difficult for every single person in the United States. But this went on to say that the U.S. Congress must sign off on the IMF funding to complete the 2010 reforms that would make China the IMF's third largest member and revamp the IMF board to reduce the dominance of Western Europe. And we can see that this would entail very big problems, and I see why they're stalling on it and they don't want to do it at this time. Now it looks like Obama is giving away the Internet control, U.S. government to release its effective control on the Internet and to hand over the keys to international bodies such as the United Nations. And of course, we know what the central bankers all want. We know exactly what they're trying to do. They want a governing body to govern all nations under one government and use the United Nations to do this. And this is why they want every single nation to sign the UN Arms Treaty, because they want to bring all this under the umbrella with other laws, with Agenda 21 and everything else. And this just fits right into it. And on September 2015, the world community will become responsible for governing the Internet through world institutions via the UN. And again, we don't know what kind of restrictions they're going to put on the Internet at this time to control what people are saying on the Internet. And we'll have to see how this affects every single person. Do I personally think this is a great idea? No, I do not. Now, 89% of Venetians are voting for independence from Italy. And again, we're seeing this happen a lot. We're seeing Moldova out there saying they want a referendum to be part of Russia. We're seeing Catalonia. They want a referendum to separate from Spain. We're seeing now the Venetians saying we don't want to be a part of Italy. And again, the entire world map is about to completely change, especially after the war. It will definitely completely change, just like we saw it change after World War II. And this goes on to say that Venetians have voted overwhelmingly for their own sovereign state in a referendum on independence from Italy. Rome government receives around 71 billion euros each year in taxes from Venice, some 21 billion euros less than it gets back in investment and services. And again, this area is wealthy. They want to separate. Italy is not doing well, the same as France, same as Spain, same as Greece, same as Cyprus. Very high unemployment, a lot of debt, and we can see why this is happening all over the place. Now, we understand that the United States is in Sudan. We understand that France is down in Central Africa. And again, they're there to make sure and maintain these countries. They have puppet governments in place. They're trying to push back Al-Qaeda terrorists, which are the people of the country. Most of the time it's China on the other side, pumping in billions of dollars of money into their infrastructure, helping them build hospitals, roads, mine their natural resources. And on the other side, what we have is the United States, the central bankers, controlling the puppet regimes and fighting against what they call Al-Qaeda or rebels. And right now, the U.S. intelligence community has maintained cooperation with Sudan, despite atrocities in Darfur and weapons shipments to the Hamas region. A leading U.S. analyst asserted that the administration of President Barack Obama has maintained cooperation with this regime amid continued human rights violations. But you notice how they don't really mind cooperating with this type of regime, because that is the puppet government in that area. They already control it, so they don't care what they do. On the opposite end, if we look at Ukraine, where they were not in control of the government, give the people democracy. Oh, human rights problems. Same thing in Syria. Human rights problems. The people want a change of government. Yes, because they do not control the government. If you switch it around, if the United States central bankers control the puppet regime, they can do whatever they want, pretty much. They don't care about human rights. They don't care what's happening to the people. The people have no rights. They're called rebels. They're called terrorists, and they push them and push them back. We see this happening in Thailand. We see it happening in Sudan, and now we see it in Ukraine, where they have their puppet regime in there. And again, they're not treating all the people the same. They're not treating them right. And again, we're seeing this happen all over the place. It is a complete double standard, because if the central bankers and the U.S. government have control of that country, they don't care about the people's rights. Now, Japan is producing a huge amount of weapons-grade plutonium. Of course, China's worried about them making a nuclear weapon. Japan was talking about creating their first nuclear weapon, but again, there are agreements in place where they cannot create a nuclear weapon. But right now, Japan's going to announce Monday that it will turn over to Washington more than 700 pounds of weapons-grade plutonium and a large quantity of highly enriched uranium, a decades-old research stockpile that is large enough to build dozens of nuclear weapons, according to U.S. and Japanese officials. Now, Iran is out there and saying, wait a minute, why the double standard? We are doing the same thing. We're keeping in line with what we're supposed to be doing. And Japan has all this weapons-grade plutonium that they can create nuclear weapons, which, according to their doctrine, they cannot, and nobody has a problem with this. Well, I'm going to tell you why. Because Japan is part of the private Western central banking system. That's why. Iran is not, and that's why they have a problem with Iran. And this is what happens every single time. Okay, now we understand that the United States has placed sanctions on Russia and the Russian people and on banks, and right now Putin's allies are suggesting that these sanctions have completely backfired. They're not doing anything, and an ally of Russian President Putin, who heads a bank that was hit by U.S. sanctions over the Crimea crisis, suggested on Sunday the move had backfired by helping him win new clients that came into the bank. And Putin said on Friday he would open an account at the Bank of Russia, and he's also having other people come and opening up accounts, and the bank was flooded with people who came in, who heard Putin was opening an account and putting his money in there in the sanctioned bank, and they wanted to do the same. And, again, they went on to say, what happens the day after a bank gets in trouble? Everyone pulls their money out. The morning after the sanctions were announced, everyone was ready to see depositors take their money out, but guess what? Nobody came. They all left their money in the bank because they're showing support for their leader, and this is why they're doing it. And again, these sanctions aren't really doing anything. I mean, Russia's sanctioning John McCain. They're sanctioning other people in Russia. They're sanctioning people in Europe. Europe is sanctioning people but it's all individual people. It's not countries, because they know what would happen if they actually went ahead and sanctioned the country of Russia. Now, we understand that Crimea, the self-defense forces, were trying to tell the Ukrainian forces, listen, here's your ultimatum. You can either come to the Russian side or go back to Ukraine. We'll help you get out of here, but you have to leave the bases because this is no longer Ukraine. And, they were trying to hold off. They were trying to stay in there. And then now, all of a sudden, Kiev says, you know what, all of you come back to Ukraine, leave Crimea at this time. And because they realize this is a no-win situation, and Crimea is no longer part of Ukraine, so there's no reason to have Ukrainian troops there at this time. Now, Obama is out there, and again, he's pushing the agenda to provoke Russia, and Obama is out there saying that, you know what, he demands Russia leave the G8, the June summit. And again, this is all about propaganda. This is all about their agenda to show that the president is actually doing something. Now, the United States is actually kind of worried about their spy satellites and how they can't get the communications from Russia. And this goes on to say that the U.S. intelligence service and the military are scrambling to expand satellite coverage and communications interception efforts across Russia amid heightened tensions over Ukrainian crisis. The plan for increased surveillance comes as U.S. military satellites spied on Russian troops near Crimea last month but failed to pick up any telltale communications. And they're worried that they might have figured out how the United States is spying, and they're blocking the communications. And, this goes on to say, even though there was a warning, we didn't have the information to be able to say exactly what was going to happen, a senior official said. And they said, what is going on here with this? Because we can't get any information, and it seems like they're blocking us. And the U.S. spy chief are worried that Russia leaders might be able to cloak their next move by shielding their communications from the U.S. spy services. Some U.S. military and intelligence office officials say Russian leaders might have used knowledge about America's surveillance techniques to change communication methods about their plans in Crimea. Now, you know where they're leading with this. They're leading into Edward Snowden. And, of course, Mike Rogers is out there, who is the chairman of Intelligence Committee, said on Sunday that U.S. counterintelligence officials believe that the former intelligence contractor, Edward Snowden, is under the influence of Russian intelligence services. Let me just say this. The only reason the NSA and all these, the Fusion Center, DHS, can spy on everybody here in the U.S. and across the globe, because they intercepted the computers, they put their firmware on these systems or software on these systems, they paid companies to have backdoors, but to block actual communications, all the Russians had to do, and anyone can do it for that matter, is create your own encryption that is not public, which is you created your own, that you know the method and you have the key. Guess what? You're shielded from them spying on you. That's how they did it. Had nothing to do with Edward Snowden. All they did was use encryption that was not public to every single person. It was their own. They wrote it. They know the method. They know the key. And now they're shielded. Just like here in the U.S., any single person can create their own encryption, keep the method to themselves, keep the key to themselves, and the NSA would not be able to hack into that. That's how simple it is. Now, Ukraine kind of cut the volume of electricity supplied to Crimea. And again, they're trying to provoke. They're pushing the agenda. And this goes on to say that Ukraine has cut the volume of electricity supplies to Crimea by 50%. Crimean First Deputy Prime Minister said after the power reduction, the Crimean electric power system carried out scheduled rolling blackouts in keeping with rules of procedures. Again, 80% of their electric comes from Ukraine. They have to import it into this area. And again, they're saying it was an accident from down wires, and this is why it's happening. But we kind of know what's going on. They're saying, listen, we have the power. We can shut your electric off. So just be warned right now. Now again, U.S. officials, they're out there saying that Russia is building up a force to invade Moldova. And we know why they're saying this. I reported on this before, and I mentioned this earlier in this report. Moldova, the people have said, and this is on the west side of Ukraine, the country of Moldova, they are saying they want a referendum to join Russia, and the U.S. cannot let this happen. So, of course, they're using the propaganda that Russia is building up forces because they'll be going into Moldova. No, the people want to vote, and they want to join Russia, just like Crimea did, just like the eastern sections of Ukraine are doing right now. Again, all we're hearing is war drums from the central bankers, U.S., EU. This is all we're hearing at this time. And of course, Ukraine officials, they're warning there's a chance of war with Russia, and it's growing. And again, we have Mike Rogers out there saying that the United States ought to provide weapons to the Ukrainian army so it could defend the country from Russian invasion. This is the same Mike Rogers who were trying to convince us that Syrians, the government of Syria, Assad, used chemical weapons against his own people. Again, we know that was a false flag. We know it was completely not true, and this is the same person trying to push war. And you have to remember, Mike Rogers is also the person who created CISPA, which is pending in the Senate. And there's other laws that they're trying to push through that are very, very similar to CISPA, which allows private corporations to give your private information and give it to the government, and it also allows the government to kind of take control of the internet. And this is why President Obama was out there creating this cyber framework, having companies volunteer their information, because he is getting ready to push this forward because they really want this law passed. Now, right now, U.S. and NATO are using Ukrainian crisis to advance military buildup in Eastern Europe. Statements issued by the White House and NATO officials over the weekend on Ukrainian crisis, including allegations that Russia is poised to invade several of its neighbors. You know, all the other countries around, they're all going to be invaded by Russia. And again, we have to look at the actions of what Russia actually did. They did no such thing as invasion. Troops were legally there in Crimea according to the agreement. They didn't bring in more troops. Actually, Ukraine, cities, towns, military officers came to Crimea. It wasn't the other way around. Russia didn't go out and pull them in with armed military force. That didn't happen. But again, they have to keep up their propaganda at this time. And Polish Defense Minister declared on Saturday that Washington must increase its military presence in Europe and also in Poland. NATO allies in Europe, we expect a larger military presence of the U.S. and that this eastern flank of NATO moved immediately. Polish Defense Minister added that it was natural, given developments in Ukraine, to discuss the prospect of permanent major U.S. base in Poland. U.S. also, remember, they deployed 12 F-16 fighter jets and 300 troops to Poland earlier this month when this whole thing came about. And Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, responded by declaring that the prospect of directly arming Ukraine was currently being reviewed at this time. And it looks like they're doing the same exact tactic that they did in Syria, the same thing that they did in Iraq, the same thing they did in Lebanon, in Libya, where they are arming the government with U.S. weapons. It's the same exact tactic they use. And again, in Syria, they were arming the rebels to overthrow the government, but once those rebels got in and they were able to set up a puppet government, believe me, the arms would flow into Syria to arm the Syrian puppet regime if that actually took place. Now, in Romania, they are saying that, and this is Romania's president, says the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, must reposition its resources in the wake of Crimea's reunification with Russia. But we have to think about this for a second. Russia already had its ships in Crimea. It already had an agreement that they were allowed to keep 25,000 troops in Crimea. So what actually has really changed, except Crimea is part of Russia? But Russia was using the base in Crimea before, so why all this repositioning? Are they repositioning for something else? That could be. Now, we understand that Ukraine has a puppet government. They were not elected. They were they weren't pushed. They were handpicked to go into power because this is what the central bankers, U.S. government, EU decided on way before they moved into Ukraine. They knew who was going to be in power, but again, they were caught on tape again, and this was a statement by Tymoshenko. And she said, after asked rhetorically by her counterparty, what should we do now with the 8 million Russians that stayed in Ukraine? They are outcasts, to which she replies, they must be killed with nuclear weapons. So these are the people they have that they put into power in Ukraine, where they don't care about the people. The government there, they don't care. The U.S. doesn't care what they're saying. The central bankers, EU, they don't care what they do as long as they keep the EU agreement, as long as they stay in power, as long as they keep control. The central bankers, US government, EU, don't care. Now, in the past couple months, we've heard a lot of propaganda out there saying that, China's, cyber attacking, they're hitting into our systems, and this is going on. They know exactly it's coming from China. Well, now China's demanding an explanation from the U.S. for their cyber attacks and from their spying. And Beijing demanded an explanation from Washington on Monday over reports that the U.S. National Security Agency had spied on Chinese ministries, banks, and other companies. The U.S. National Security Agency spied on the leaders of China, as well as Chinese banks and telecommunications giant. So we can see what is happening right now. It feels like every time the government tells us that another country is actually doing something, it turns out the U.S. government is actually doing the same exact thing, or worse. And again, this is a complete buildup. It is all propaganda to make you believe that all these countries that do not have a private Western Central Bank, China, Russia, Iran, Syria, North Korea, they want you to believe that these are the nations that are supposed to be our enemy. And this is what they continually do. Now, of course, in Syria, we understand the Geneva II talks didn't go anywhere. And guess what? Well, they're not going to have any more Geneva talks because they realize that the U.S. agenda was to replace Assad, and there's absolutely no purpose in having any more talks at this point because they understand that Assad is not going to step down. And again, he's not going to step down. He's winning. He's pushing the rebels out of his country. He's taking back the country, and now the central bankers, the U.S. government, their backs are against the wall, and they have to make their next move, and this is what they've been planning on. Well, in Turkey, we understand that elections are coming up. Erdogan is a puppet government controlled by the central bankers, U.S. government. He was trying to shut down Twitter. He shut down the Google DNS. making it so people can't get on social media, again, because people are coming out against him. But of course, the U.S. government, central bankers, European nation, very quiet on this. But the opposition has charged that Erdogan, who has already banned Twitter, could order military operations in Syria on the eve of municipal elections on March 30th. Opposition leaders said an invasion could mark a last-minute attempt by Erdogan's Justice and Development Party to stave off defeat. Now, I can see this having a different type of ramification on Syria here, because if Turkey starts to invade, United States might step in, Israel might step in, and this could be blown out of proportion at this time. And we're going to have to watch this on March 30th. And this goes on to say that we've received unconfirmed information. Everyone should be very careful that there could be some type of invasion. Now, at the same time that this is happening, we see other things happening. Israel is closing its embassies. Now they're talking about that they're closing them because they didn't get their pay raise that they've been fighting for over 2 years now. This just seems very convenient to close down all embassies and all people to be on strike at the same time that all this is coming about. But again, we'll have to see. And again, the strike is now open-ended because of the employment conditions for Israeli diplomats and because of the draconian decision by the Treasury to cut workers' salaries. And again, this has been going on for 2 years. It's just very interesting that it's right at this moment that they're striking and the embassies are closed and they're not open for business. At the same time that Turkey might invade Syria. But let's move a little bit further here. We understand that a student in Georgetown University, who was 19, Daniel Harry Millsman, was creating ricin in his dorm room. And again, this goes on to say that he was able to create ricin by going on the internet and finding the ingredients in retail stores. And this internet thing is a very bad thing because he used his iPhone to go on the internet to find the recipe for ricin, and this revelation has once again drawn attention to the fact how virtually limitless possibilities of information access on the internet may reach the point when it becomes dangerous, and the government might have to step in and try to control the internet so people don't have this information. See how they're turning this and they're trying to make this play? And again, this is all leading into what is going to happen, because every time there's a false flag event, we always see anthrax, ricin letters being delivered, and it's, again, this is all part of the same false flag that they always use. And now another false flag warning: lone wolf jihadists told to target the Queen at high-profile sporting events, including Wimbledon and other events. Again, Propaganda magazine lists London's Savoy Hotel a target. Top 5 MI5 and MI6 operations tracking Syria-trained British jihadists. Al-Qaeda terrorists in Syria have been ordered to target the Queen at British sporting events. More than half the 400 extremists who travel from UK to fight in Damascus have returned home, sparking a surge in security measures. Al-Qaeda urges followers to bomb London's Savoy Hotel with instructions on how to make a car bomb. Again, building the propaganda. We saw this in Al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine in the U.S., where they said they were going to hit all these different areas. Now, Clapper is out there saying that the U.S. intelligence community has determined that Iran, despite its agreement with the West, would continue to enhance its nuclear weapons capabilities. The official said the community, despite assurances by the White House, assessed that Tehran would continue with nuclear weapons research and could stockpile enriched uranium at undeclared facilities. Now, you have to remember, the UN inspectors were already in Iran, and they said there is no sign whatsoever that they are building a nuclear weapon at all. But the U.S. has its own intelligence. The intelligence community warned that Iran would not cooperate with the United States in the Gulf or the rest of the Middle East. Clapper said Iran was aiding Shiite rebels in Bahrain and Yemen, as well as arming Palestinian Palestinian militias. Iran will continue to act assertively abroad in ways that run counter to U.S. interests and worsen region conflicts, Clapper said. Iranian officials almost certainly believe that their support has been instrumental in sustaining President Assad, they're bringing in Assad on this, regime in Syria and will probably continue supporting during 2014 to bolster the regime. Clapper said Iran's allies were also developing weapons of mass destruction. So they brought in Syria, they brought in nuclear weapon, and they brought in the word weapons of mass destruction to make us all believe. And again, he's saying that Assad right now is creating sarin gas, is creating mustard gas, and again he has some type of evidence that Syria is creating biological warfare. They have a biological warfare program, and it is they might have advanced beyond the research and development stage, and they might be capable of a limited strike with these agents. So they are definitely building up the propaganda right now, and now they're bringing in Iran for cyber attacking. They brought in Iran for nuclear weapons, Syria with chemical biological, and now they're bringing in Iran for cybersecurity. Both governments and private cybersecurity experts are increasingly considering Iran a top 10 cyber threat. Iran recent activities and its motives have led analysts to rank the countries among other cyberspace heavy hitters such as Russia and China. So Iran right now is part of Russia and China in cyber threats. And the New York Times, it's out there, reports that American officials believed that several recent computer attacks could be traced back to Iran. Of course, these targets, the Times notes, included several American oil, gas, electricity companies, as well as financial institutions on Wall Street and large system operations. And recently, attacks have included the U.S. Navy's intranet, the largest unclassified network in the service arsenal. And again, what they are saying to us is that they have already attacked financial institutions. They already learned how to attack the financial institutions that could bring down the economy. They've learned how to attack the power grid, the infrastructure of the power grid. Again, they are building this propaganda up. Now Iran fits in with China and Russia. So we see the Syrian Electronic Army cyber attacking many of the different areas. They continually come out and tell us it's the SEA. Now Iran is saying that they're in the top 10 threat. They've already cyber attacked the financial institutions. They've already infiltrated the power grid and the water systems. And again, we can see what they're doing now. They're also building up the propaganda about nuclear weapons and how they're funding Syria and keeping them going. So they're putting them and classifying them into one group. And we see all this propaganda coming out in a very short period of time. Listen, everyone, be well, be safe, and especially be prepared. Thanks a lot.